folks, this is our future. We're starting in a few minutes, so sit tight. We're gonna get started in just about a minute, so sit tight. Thanks for joining us. Welcome everybody, welcome to the Everyone In Advocacy Town Hall, focus on our future LA. It's good to have you all. We still got folks popping in here, so we always try to let Frank take over the beats for a few minutes so that we get some stragglers in here. We're going to do intros in a minute, but my name is Mike Dennis. I'm the Director of Organizing with the United Way, and I work exclusively on the Everyone In campaign. We're going to do intros in a few minutes, but we got a couple things we want to cover very quickly, just some housekeeping items. Zoom basics. I think you all have pretty familiar with Zoom at this point. We do get, once in a while, we get uninvited visitors that try to do crazy, inappropriate things. So we are monitoring the best that we can. We will unmute everybody once we get to the Q&A section. Yes, introduce yourself in the chat. Click that gallery view if you want to see all of our faces. You have our panel today. Really awesome group of folks here. And I don't think you can rename yourself, so don't worry about that one. And then next piece is that I want to say is that we do sign in. So if you joined this Zoom today, There's going to be a link dropped in the chat in a second here. Actually, let me do that. And you can sign in. This helps us keep track of who shows up for stuff when they get our really annoying texts and phone calls, because we don't want to bug you if you don't want to be here. So please take a second to sign in at some point throughout this presentation. Before we get to intros, I want to pass it off to Gabriella, our Deputy Director, who's going to do a land acknowledgement. Gabby.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. Thank you for joining us. Per usual, we really like to start with the land acknowledgement to honor the peoples who have stewarded and nurtured this land we now call LA County, but I want to acknowledge the Tongva and the Chumash that reigned from Santa Barbara all the way from Malibu, and the Tongva, you know, all LA proper, and San Gabriel Valley. And so now, as you know, as people of Los Angeles, ones that we love Los Angeles, we will die for Los Angeles. We are now tasked with the task to really steward the land and to fight for this land, to ensure that we're building the housing we need for our unhoused neighbors, and for and fight for everyone who lives here. So that is all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gabriella. And Gabriella will also be working on the chat. So if you guys have questions or anything like that, she'll be doing her best there to keep track of everything. I'm going to pass it off to my colleague, Sarah Thomas, to introduce our wonderful panel today. Sarah.
Hey all, Sarah Thomas with United Way. Thanks for joining. You already met Mike. He's part of the United Way team, as is Gabby. And then we're going to have a couple of other folks who are joining us today, just giving us some information around our future LA. And so you'll be hearing from Steve Diaz. He's from LA CAN. We have Mari Manji from Inner City Law Center and Chase Englehart from Climate Resolve. So you're going to be hearing a lot from the five of us during this time, and we look forward to chatting with you all. So we're going to go ahead and get started in just talking about kind of housing and homelessness broadly, and do a broad overview, and just kind of share a little bit about what we're doing within the housing and homelessness crisis. So to start us out with that, I'm going to pass it back over to Mike.
So our introduction, I'm sorry, the workshop format today is we're going to do this overview of the Our Future LA Coalition. That is the focus of today's conversation. It's a really exciting coalition that we've been working on this entire year. And then we're gonna dive into sort of the four big pieces of the platform, and then we will open it up for some Q&A, getting different perspectives from our panelists. Madi works over at Inner City Law, so definitely doing a lot of tenant protections work. Chase is doing climate justice work across the county. And then Steve Diaz, if you haven't heard of LA CAN, where have you been? Because LA CAN is definitely a staple in Los Angeles organizing and in the social justice space. And they play a really critical role organizing unhoused people on Skid Row and around some really important policies. Frank, hook me up with that next slide. There we go. Okay, so Sarah, do you want to do this, or you want me to take this one?
You go for it. I thought you had this one, so you jump right in.
Sure, I'll do this one. So we're going to set a little bit of context for folks that maybe, I think a lot of us are housing advocates who pay attention to this on the regular, but we want to make sure that everybody's level set. So over the last 10 years in the LA metro area, we've lost a lot of units. We've lost 200,000 units that have affordable rents. 750,000 households in the county right now spend more than half of their income on housing. And if you actually zero in on certain communities, it's as high as 80% of their income. So that's an aggregate, and certainly not the case for some communities that are really, really getting hit hard. So we're dealing with a major housing affordability shortage. And this is directly connected to wages. So 79% of extremely low income households in LA County are paying most of their income towards housing costs, compared to just 3% of people that live in moderate households. The wages, if you look at a graph, I don't think we have the graph today on this slide, but if you look at wages and you look at cost of living has gone straight up and wages have actually just kind of tapered off. And so it's creating a tale of two cities. Frank, hit me with that next slide. So before we jump into what our future LA is, I want to open it up to our panelists just very, very quickly. What does the current housing situation look like for your base, for the folks that you serve? And maybe we can start with Steve Diaz, if you want to speak a little bit to the ramifications of these pretty staggering numbers.
Yeah, for sure. I think these numbers, we see these numbers and how they impact LA County and LA City every day we walk through the streets of our neighborhoods. When you see tons of houseless folks increasing every day, LA Can organizes in Skid Row and in South LA. And we hear the stories every day of folks not being able to qualify because they don't have enough money, because their credit report sucks, or even because the landlord just is trying to figure out how to get them out of their place and get someone else in. So like the tenant harassment piece. So definitely these numbers impact in multiple ways, everything from what you see on the street to sort of the day-to-day sort of hustling and bustling and struggling to survive.
And Madi, Intercity Law directly works with tenants. Can you say a little bit more about what that work has looked like for you guys?
Yeah, I mean, I think these numbers really kind of like set the groundwork of like how bad the situation is. Intercity Law Center, a lot of our work is defending the tenants who find themselves in these positions, right? We're talking about tenants who, you know, really a landlord is looking to sometimes evict every single tenant in a building and just, you know, obviously much of the older stock of housing in LA County is rental, is RSO. And we find a lot of cases where landlords are trying to evict everybody and just bring in a whole new class of tenants. You know, other problem is a lot of landlords just, you know, have been waiting. Those are like the most egregious cases, right? The more standard cases are landlords like, oh shoot, this tenant's a little bit behind on the rent. You know, maybe $100, maybe $200, maybe $500. Let's take this opportunity to evict this tenant and reset the rents to market rate. And so the one thing that we know is, you know, we're fighting really hard to end homelessness by creating all these new affordable housing units. But if we don't stop the inflow, the people who are sort of like on the edge of homelessness, who are trying to stay in their home, who are you know, one paycheck away from losing their house, a couple $100 away from losing their house. We'll be talking about that a little bit later in the hour about what are some of those ways. But that's kind of the work that we do, is we make sure people stay in their homes. Some of the other work we do is make sure people get benefits they need, such as SSI and other rental benefits to make sure they're able to stay in their house.
Thank you, Madi. Chase, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, the climate crisis intersects with the housing crisis on so many levels. I think to build on what Steve and Madi are talking about, if you are paying 90% of your income towards rent, you probably can't afford to turn on your air conditioning in the midst of a heat wave. Your neighborhood very likely has a less stable grid than a higher income neighborhood. And so when there is a heat wave that is compromising the grid, you're probably more likely to experience a blackout. On top of that, having something like an air purifier in your home during wildfires, you know, these are all things that intersect with even just general wealth, right? And housing is so deeply tied into that, whether you're able to build intergenerational wealth through home ownership or just really afford your rent, like truly be able to afford your rent, not just survive. That's a huge, huge part of that. And then, you know, for the folks that are unhoused, even more so, right? There is no indoor air quality if you do not live indoors. So we very much are aware of the intersection of how climate disproportionately can affect you if you're really just hanging on by your fingertips or street-based.
Thank you so much, you guys. So this is a good segue to talk about our future LA. So I want to try to make this concise. I could go on and on about this, but you know, for the last 20 years, LA has been struggling to find ways to build more affordable housing. And when I say affordable housing, I don't just mean tax credit projects, but all different kinds of affordable. We have 650,000 rent controlled units in the city of LA. That's the largest portfolio of affordable housing that we have. Naturally occurring affordable, some people call it. But the county as a whole, and then if you blow out to the state, we just have not been able to keep up with the pace of population growth, with the needs of different communities. And we've created this the situation we're in, where we are now trying to aggressively backfill a problem that sometimes feels pretty insurmountable. There's been a lot of different organizing projects over the years, really important projects and really important policies that have come out of really solid community organizing in the city of LA and in the county. But we haven't really been able to bite the apple straight on. We've been kind of nibbling around the edges. We haven't been able to create mass system level change around this. And so this is really the reason why our Future LA was formed. A lot of the organizations in our Future LA come out of the housing space, but a lot of them don't. And I think this is one of the unique opportunities that we have with this coalition. Over a year ago, we started having informal conversations among service providers, housing developers, affordable housing developers, climate groups, organizations that do land use, local control work, alternative models to home ownership. So at labor, right? We've talked to a lot of these different organizations, and we came up with a platform that we felt was really going to try something new and big, even if it felt politically tough. And as you know, right now in the city of LA, we're going to talk about this later, it's really hard to get our city leaders to pay attention to the right things. And it's really hard to get our city and our county and our state leaders to pay attention to things beyond the next election cycle, something that's long-term, that might be unpopular in the short term, but in the long term might end up being the best thing for us, right? Diverting massive amounts of resources. So you see here who the coalition is. We've got a really awesome steering committee of folks that represent these different sectors of our communities. And then on the right side, you see the larger list of organizations there, and that list is growing every day. So we've worked really hard to put together a diverse coalition that's gonna not just be narrowly focused on housing, but it's gonna be focused on direct community investment, making sure that we keep people in our homes, and creating more resource-rich communities and access to wealth. So that's a great segue. I'm going to pass it to Madi, and actually all of our panelists are going to sort of walk us through these different pieces of this platform. There's 4 sections on this platform, so we'll take one at a time. Madi, over to you.
Thank you, Mike. Well, I think the first one, and I don't know if we can move over the slide, or the first one is help people stay in their current homes, right? I mean, I think it sounds pretty basic, but the whole idea is there is no way we're going to solve homelessness. No way we're going to sort of end the affordable housing crisis if folks are continually being displaced on an active basis. You've all heard stories. I'm sure you have family and friends who have been forced to leave LA County. I know myself, my grandpa used to live out in Carson, Compton area. He's now in Eastville. My wife's family, they were out in Orange County. They're now in Corona, right? The housing crisis is really such that people are having difficulty just staying in the communities that they've been in for the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years. I mean, 59% of households in LA County are rent burdened. We don't have the numbers up here, but you know, some people are rent burdened as in they pay 31% of their income towards rent, but some people are rent burdened as in they pay 90% of their income towards rent. Chase mentioned a number. I think it's 600,000 families, 600,000 households who are paying 90% of their income towards rent. I mean, I just want you to like imagine about that for like, you know, 10 seconds. Think about that. Like, you know, you make $2,000, 90% of that income towards rent. That's $1,800, right? Like that's not even a crazy rent in LA County. That might be a good deal you have there. But really, we're talking about a number of policies that help alleviate the situation. Obviously, we have a rent control ordinance in the city of Los Angeles, city of West Hollywood, city of Beverly Hills, city of Santa Monica. But oftentimes, folks are not fully aware of the rights that they have under these ordinances. They're not aware that sort of landlords can't evict anyone for any reason, right? You have to give a list of specific reasons. That every city is a little bit different. There's around 12 or so reasons, which are called the just cause to evict. And one of the ways we can enforce these laws is what's called a right to counsel. Everybody knows that if you can't afford an attorney and you've been indicted for a crime, the court is required to provide you an attorney. That same sort of right doesn't apply for evictions. So if you are sort of being evicted by a landlord, but you can't afford an attorney, right now there's no right for an attorney. And so one of the policies that we've been fighting for is a countywide right to counsel. The idea that if you are sort of subject to an eviction, if your landlord wants to evict you, that you have the right to counsel, the right to attorney, that will sort of enforce the various laws that California has. Whether that's a rent control law, a local law, whether that's statewide law like AB 1482, which doesn't allow the landlord to increase the rent by more than 5% plus inflation in any given year. Whether that's just cause, right? Is the landlord sort of following one of those 12 reasons to evict you, or they can't really, or are they trying to evict you illegally? One of the other things is the condition of your housing sort of meeting all the legal requirements? Is there mold? Is there sort of rats or cockroaches, right? Sometimes we know landlords are not fully maintaining their properties to the legal requirement, right? So having an attorney there really helps you enforce those laws. I'm seeing some folks in the comments talking about rental relief, talking about a couple other things. This is all part of it, right? Because even if you're entitled to rental relief, you might not know that. And so having an attorney is always helpful. One of the other things that we've mentioned here is the Ellis Act reform is definitely a long-term goal of our future LA. We know that landlords often use the Ellis Act, which is a law that allows landlords to essentially evict everyone in the building, and so take that building out of the rental market. The landlords often use this law to do condo conversions, or to sometimes evict everybody and then maybe keep the apartments or the building empty for a couple of years and then start renting again. There's a lot of abuse surrounding this law, so we're trying to look at ways how can we limit the use of this law. And ensure that the landlords are following all the requirements and making sure that the payments that the tenants are entitled to during the Ellis Act, eviction are sort of like worth the actual market rate of those evictions. We know that oftentimes you'll have a tenant who's in a rental unit for a long time. Their unit, their rental their rent might be substantially lower than the market rate. We're talking about maybe someone in South LA. I know a friend who lives out in Baldwin Park area, Baldwin Hills area. He has a 2-bedroom apartment for $1,300, right? And if you look around today for that same apartment, probably closer to $1,800, $1,900, right? So really just making sure that folks are able to stay in their homes, able to stay in their communities, and not subject to the whims of the market. And I think all of this plays in a number of benefits, right? First of all, people get to stay in their place, people get to stay rooted in their communities. But more importantly, and then the other aspect, which is the very immediate aspect, is that's one person who's able to stay in their home and one person who is not on the street, and really allows the state to, the city, the county, to focus the resources on the people who are already on the street, already in that most difficult position, but really make sure that people don't get there, because we know that housing is really one of those critical pieces. And once you lose that, you're more likely to lose your job. You're more likely to lose your car. You're more likely to end up in jail. You're more likely to, face severe healthcare issues and end up in a hospital or worse. Yeah, that's really what we're doing here. This is a major priority for our future LA, and very happy for all of us to be here and fight for this.
So another key piece of the platform, if folks can move to the next slide for me, please, is really about creating more affordable homes across LA. It's interesting, Mari talked about, it's about keeping folks in their homes. And one of the key ways you keep folks in your homes is by allowing there to be creation of affordable housing in communities, right? Because this is all about building diverse communities, whether it be in vibrant areas or quote unquote non-vibrant areas. The numbers need to add up, and there needs to be creation for poor, especially low income housing, but there needs to be housing creation overall that's not targeted at the highest income levels, as has been the case for a very long time now. So you ain't gotta be a mathematician to see the chart that's there. For folks can see it. The first line really talks about the goals of the regional housing needs assessment, which is really a tool that's done to see what exactly needs to be built, right? And the projection is that you need 25% for extremely and very low income housing. And what's being projected based on what's on the table right now is only 6%, right? If you look at every other number, none of this adds up. And in order to build communities, in order to help, in order to have an actual future LA where communities can be diverse and sort of, there could be the resources and wealth that's needed, you have to be able to build homes. And in order to do that, one of the ways that we're engaging in is through La Casa, which folks will hear later, but also through engaging in planning and land use efforts, such as the regional housing needs assessment, which oftentimes are tools that are forgotten about, but definitely these land use tools help and sort of set the groundwork for what comes into our communities. So one of the key for our future LA is ensuring that there could be more affordable homes across LA. And I'll pass it to Chase.
Thanks, Steve. If we could go to the next slide, I'll talk to our third point, which is to ensure every community is resource rich. It's really important to remember that, even as we're living these atomized, I mean, we're coming out a little bit, but atomized lives from COVID-19, we're not just thinking about housing, we're really thinking about communities. And so being able to afford a roof over your head is just a piece of that, but people also deserve to have access to healthy food, to services, to healthcare, and all of those resources in their community. And LA is a place with a lot of historic harm, right? We are a very racially segregated city and county. We're the 6th most segregated metropolitan area. A recent study just showed. And so repairing the harms of redlining, white flight, freeway construction is going to take a lot more than just being able to have people able to afford their homes. It's going to mean tackling exclusionary policies and sentiment in wealthy white neighborhoods. And it's also a very intentional process to work with communities to resource communities that had toxic uses placed near them, that were stripped of their community resources for decades, almost centuries at this point. So we're going to have to work really, really intentionally to do that. And I don't want to take up too much time, so I'll pass it on to the fourth point.
Oh, that's me. All right. Thank you, guys. So the fourth piece is we've got to create something that doesn't exist right now, because the existing infrastructure that we have at the governmental level to execute large scale affordability projects does not exist. We have a very decentralized process for building affordable housing across the county. And so one of the big pieces of our platform here is creating a regional housing solutions agency. So it takes, when you look at LA County, we have 88 cities, 88 governments. All of those governments have multiple characters that are elected to those bodies, and they all have different views on how to deal with issues in their communities. And generally, that's what we like. We want local control. We want to have communities making decisions and coming up with solutions for their own problems. But the problem with that is that we don't have a standardized approach across the region, and this is really a regional problem. And so if you're a developer right now, if you're an affordable housing developer, you basically have got to go it alone. You've got to find multiple layers of financing from public and private dollars. A lot of times a line of credit from a bank is going to be contingent on you winning a line of credit from Triple H money, for example, which is no longer around anymore, by the way. But you have to piece together this layer cake of financing, and then you've got to go through local approvals, and you've got to do community engagement. All of these things take time, and when you stretch all of that out over 4 years, the cost per unit just goes through the roof. We don't have standardized metrics for how we dish out our housing dollars. And so what you have is sort of a hodgepodge of development, and we're not really delivering the amount of units that we need to the income levels that need them the most. And as Steve just showed you guys a little while ago, we have really, really stark projections on what type of housing is going to actually get financed and built. And we're leaving out everybody that's in the iceberg, but below the water surface, right? The people that we can't see right now, the people that are at risk of falling into homelessness. The Housing Solutions Agency is right now in the form of Senate Bill 679 at the state of California. It's right now in the Assembly. We're going to talk more about that in a minute, but I'm going to pass it over to Sarah to talk about what this agency actually would do. And the acronym is La Casa. So it's the LA County Affordable Housing Solutions Agency. And I didn't come up with that. Somebody much more clever than I did. But Sarah, do you want to sort of break down for folks how this agency would deal with renter protections, building new housing, preserving old housing, and expanding ownership opportunities?
Yeah, so one of the things that's really cool about La Casa is that, we've been talking about all these different priorities that our future LA has, things that we really want to make happen that aren't happening, or maybe they are happening, but we want them to happen on a bigger level. So a lot of those things are encompassed within La Casa. One aspect of that is the renter protections that Madi was talking about. He was sharing about right to counsel. Well, right to counsel needs funding, and that's one of the big issues that has happened with right to counsel kind of getting the momentum that it needs, is that it hasn't had a mechanism for having the funding that it needs in order to actually operate and give folks the counsel that they need. So we would be able to do that through this agency. We would also be able to do different types of funding for people to have rental assistance, both short-term and long-term. That can look like something similar to Section 8, or it can be responding to a crisis like we've had with COVID-19. So there's those aspects of protections that are going to be part of it. We'll also be able to have different ways of making sure that we preserve the housing that we already have. Because if we're losing housing and we're not building enough housing, that's a huge issue. So we need to make sure that we're preserving the housing we have. A lot of the affordable housing out there and the supportive housing out there has limited number of years that they're going to be required to operate as affordable. And once that time is up, and that rent can be raised. And so this would allow for opportunities for us to extend those years of affordable housing and make sure that the folks that are in that housing stay in it and that it stays affordable. Then it's also going to do what Mike was just talking about, where it's cutting the red tape, making it easier, faster, cheaper to build the affordable housing that we need, and to do it at the scale that we need, and do it just more efficiently, and do it through different aspects other than the funding that's available now. So if we have more opportunities to not just use governmental funding, but also use private funding, use tax dollars in order to get this housing built, that'll really open up opportunities for people to get more funding to build this type of housing. And then the last piece of it is trying to really increase housing ownership. So, we've talked a lot about rentals, but what about owning the home that you've been renting, or being able to get assistance on a down payment for a house? We're including all of those in La Casa to try to incorporate these different aspects of the housing crisis so that we can really break out of it in ways that we haven't been before. So I'll go ahead and pass it over for us to talk about kind of the ways that we're really working on that right now and digging deep into these issues.
Awesome. Thank you, Sarah. So we just gave you the 4 points to our platform. Lots of coalitions have platforms that don't go anywhere. We're trying to not be that. We're trying to actively tackle these things. So like we just mentioned, SB 679 is in the state legislature. I'm going to let Madi explain like where that is. But that's one thing that we're working on like right now. It's been a core focus of the coalition. We've been doing a ton of work with all of our partners to make sure that this thing sees the light of day. We're also confronting citywide pushes for criminalization and segregation. It's been a really rough week. We had 4118 just get voted on today in the council. There are a lot of implications around what that means. I will wait for Steve to enlighten us on what's going on there and what we can do next. But the key piece here is that we are actively, because our coalition is so diverse, we've got a lot of different issue areas that we're trying to link up through our platform. So doing the state bill, doing the citywide advocacy on the ground level for folks that are currently unhoused and are being criminalized is very important. And then also, connecting the dots on things like climate justice and housing justice and racial justice. The climate justice piece we're lifting up today because this is a conversation that climate justice work has often lived in its own bubble, I guess you could say, where a lot of housing justice folks don't pay attention to this stuff. A lot of tenant rights groups care about it philosophically, but on a programmatic level aren't doing a lot around climate justice and environmental justice. And so we're really working to try to break all of our different organizations out of these silos, get us out of our comfort zone and start talking about issues that might directly impact the people that we are working for, but we don't actually work on specific bills or legislation that helps advance those things. I'm going to pass it over to Madi. Tell us about what 679 does. Obviously, it's La Casa, but where is it at? What's coming up? We got a big month in August. What do people need to know about this?
Yeah, so 679 is obviously the bill that would create La Casa, the Los Angeles County Affordable Housing Solutions Agency, which I'm told was random. They came up with that name, but we need Speaker Rendon to refer this bill to the policy committee ASAP. So when it comes to sort of where committees are in the Capitol, essentially, once this bill has passed this bill passed the Senate and is now gone over to the Assembly, and the Speaker needs to assign this to one of the policy committees, so then they can discuss it further, add any amendments, vote on it, send it to the Assembly floor, and then send it back to the Senate and Assembly and back to the governor. Right now, it's stuck with the political fight that Anthony Rendon, the Speaker of the California Assembly, is having with the Senate, the California State Senate, and with some of the labor trades. It's a fight called the skilled and trained. There's an amendment in this bill that would sort of require the projects to use labor from union labor, and create more union jobs. And this Speaker is not particularly happy about that. He's not particularly happy with the Senate, and that's why he's holding this bill. We think that this bill is a lot bigger than any of the political quabbles that the Senate and Assembly are having with each other and the labor and Assembly is having with each other. And we think it's really important that Anthony Rendon release this bill to one of the policy committees, the Housing Policy Committee, as soon as possible. So that's something we need you to call up your Assembly member and tell them that you support SB 679 and that the Speaker should move this over to the policy committee. And if you live in Assembly Member Rendon's office, it's even more important. Give him a call and be like, "What's going on, bro? Release this bill."
And we'll provide a link for a click to call function. So it's really easy for folks to just click the link. It'll connect you directly to Rendon's office. Our ask to you is to call him up and say, "Hey, what's going on with 679? We really want to see this get moved into the Assembly floor." We have till the end of August to make that happen, so it's go time. All right, let's go over to Steve. Tell us a little bit more about what's going on with these recent criminalization efforts in the city of LA.
Yeah, for sure. I just want to start off by saying, when folks hear on the news or folks talk about a couple of different fights that have been happening recently, there's a couple of words that need to be, that are oftentimes forgotten. So when you hear about 4118, you hear about Venice, or you hear about the Judge Carter lawsuit, these are not things that are happening because they're for hope or for benefit. These are things that are happening to continue to segregate communities and continue to keep folks apart from each other, first and foremost. And secondarily, they're not actual resources that are being provided to folks. All these things that are happening, whether it be 4118, which was recently passed by the city council, it's now on its way to the mayor's office, which basically creates a policy that limits where folks can have a bodily function of resting. Think about that. So there's a policy that just got passed under the auspices of housing and services and benefits from everyone, quote unquote, that limits overall bodily sort of functions, ability of sleeping and resting. So that's one thing. The Judge Carter lawsuit, quote unquote, provides resources. What it does is it provides a shift in the political narrative from long-term permanent solutions, such as permanent supportive housing and housing first models, to an emergency shelter sort of temporary base, you're in, you're out. We all know that emergencies need to be addressed, but at the same time, priorities need to be clear in terms of spending. And when you see what's happening in Venice, that once again highlights where the spending dynamics are occurring. Millions of dollars are being spent to police folks into smaller areas so they're out of sight, out of mind, instead of investing those monies into housing creation. One of the things we talked about earlier in terms of our future was we need to build more affordable housing, right? We need to fund it. And one of the ways is really figuring out how to shift this political dynamic from, oh, it's all about temporary and criminalization into actual long-term solutions. Lastly, the reasons why we're fighting against this is because we definitely believe that in order to have a future where every community can be safe and sort of stable, you got to be able to welcome everyone to the community with the resources that are needed. So this is just a quick sort of overview of what's going on. Definitely always remember those three words. They're not good, they're actually bad, and they're taking away from your neighborhoods and our neighborhoods, most importantly.
Thank you very much, Steve. So we're going to go back over to Chase to talk about this linkage between climate and housing justice, because I think it's still an abstract issue for a lot of folks. Break it down for us.
Yeah, what's climate got to do with it? Why is this guy here? I like to think of it as we've all been playing the same sport on the same field without even realizing it. We're actually all, we need to work towards the same goal. Housing affordability, having well-resourced neighborhoods, having people be able to stay in their homes are all absolutely inextricable from addressing the climate crisis. If we don't do those things, we can't address the climate crisis, and vice versa. If we don't address the climate crisis, we're going to have a heck of a time housing people, being able to maintain people in their homes, et cetera. So there's a lot of information on this one slide. It's a little dense, but I want to start breaking it down. Let's start over on the right on this map here to see what we're looking at. In Los Angeles, we have all different kinds of disparities among where people are living across class and race. And one of those is in tree canopy. And this is something the climate has gotten hotter in past years that has gotten more media attention. But lower income Black and brown communities have way less trees than wealthier, whiter communities. And that's what you actually see in green here is the tree cover in communities in Los Angeles. What you're seeing in orange and red is actually surface temperatures. So once they get past significant temperatures around the low hundreds to high 140, remember surface temperatures, the ground, air temperature is a little bit different, they're related. But what we can see is that Black and brown communities are typically hotter and have less tree canopy. And that plays in a lot of ways. Climate really intersects things that we might not think about. Like, for example, the LAPD in the 90s cutting down trees in Compton so that it would be easier to access the area with helicopters. So really thinking about climate as bringing protection for people, because we often think about climate as ecosystems, which is incredibly important work, can't be understated, but we're also looking at LA, one of the most populous regions in the world. So we're really thinking about how climate affects people. And so having well-resourced communities is climate resilience, right? The climate has changed. And we need to be able to adapt to that. So being able to have resources like trees, cool technology. So there are reflective roofs and pavement that can actually reflect some of the sun's light back out into space. And that can actually cool communities and fight the urban heat island effect. There are a lot of solutions, but those can't be distributed unequally. And so that's something that we need to think about in terms of how we are protecting folks. The other thing that we need to think about is addressing climate directly, right? So rather than just adapting, how do we stop it from getting worse? And, you know, in the most populous state in the United States, it makes sense that where we live and how we get around plays a huge role in that. It's actually the biggest role in that, right? So 41% of our emissions come from transportation. That is, as you can see from this pie chart, far and away the largest source of our emissions. And of that, it's mostly personal vehicles. Of the entire state's emissions, it's around 28%. So you can see 24% is industrial, and that's including the production of gas. So every single smokestack in the state of California produces less greenhouse gas emissions than just the cars that we drive. So obviously being able to live close to resources in your community, having resources close in your community, or being able to afford to live close to where you work is hugely, hugely important for the climate. And that sort of concept is called urban infill, right? So if we're moving housing right now, the most affordable places to live are far, far, far flung. And so when we see the inland empire or the deserts, the high desert, seeing these sprawling developments happen, people are having to commute 2, 3, sometimes even 4 hours to work. And that plays a big role. It also means a lot of destruction of ecosystems in those areas, right? The more laterally we spread, the more that we have to develop undeveloped land. And so that all plays a huge, huge role in how quickly the climate crisis accelerates. So by creating affordability in Los Angeles, we're actually addressing one of the cornerstones of climate policy. So it's really, really important that we realize that we're pulling the same direction, especially because there's so many elements of it, right? If you're looking at it purely from a climate standpoint, it's like, okay, we just need as many units as possible right now in LA without thinking about anything else. But of course, there's all of these racial and socioeconomic disparities, there's abusive landlords. So coming together in a coalition like this is a really, I think, unique opportunity to have a really intersectional lens and have important conversations about how we can provide lasting solutions and kind of really achieve justice on a lot of these issues at once.
I think we got one more slide there. There we go.
Oh, right. Yeah. So that's basically the gist of what I was saying, right? Sprawl has not only fueled racist outcomes, but it's the largest contributor to climate change in California for decades, right? So previously, right, it was kind of the product of white flight, white folks moving out of cities, building freeways so they could come back and work in the city and then hightail it home in the evening. And now we have poor air quality, climate change, and of course, Black and brown communities are suffering the brunt of that, whether it be from environmental degradation, from polluting sources, extreme heat, wildfire smoke, et cetera.
Thank you very much. That was super informative and thorough, Chase. So we're almost to the Q&A section, y'all. Couple quick things. I want to do one more pump up on the coalition itself. If you want to check out more info about our future, bam, there's the link. Just so folks understand, because we like to be transparent how the coalition is structured. We have a steering committee. We have an organizing committee that's smaller and lives within the steering committee. And then we have the larger coalition itself. And so the steering committee and the organizing committee meet regularly on a weekly basis. And that's how we're getting all this work done. That's how we're getting all decisions made on SB 679. We just had a really great press conference a couple days ago out of Venice around the issues that Steve was talking about. But the coalition's not closed to just organizations. If you want to support us, check out the website, sign up. You can get alerts. You can follow us on social media. We are going to start doing things in person. Delta willing, we'll see how things go. We're obviously going to be really safe. But our hope is to start doing more real life organizing and starting to have more meetings in person again soon, so we can get the hell off of Zoom. And so, yeah, I want to just do a plug there. I think at this point, we're going to do Q&A for a few minutes. I'm going to unmute folks because I feel like folks are feeling this. I don't know. We'll see. Let me see. Okay, so we have multiple ways you can raise your hand if you want to just drop a question in the chat. Our panel will just try to wing it here and see if we can answer your questions. We might not have an answer for your question, but we'll do our best. So yeah, any questions folks might have about anything that we presented, and we will also be sending out this deck via email, and the recording. So if you missed something we said because we were talking too fast, don't sweat it. Questions. Don't be shy, y'all. I have one question for Madi, and maybe that'll give some folks some breathing room to think about what they want to say. Madi, can you talk about like the right to counsel piece? What happens typically when you go to court for eviction and you don't have a lawyer with you?
I mean, that's pretty straightforward answer. I mean, if you don't have a lawyer with you, I think the numbers are like 90% of landlords have attorneys, and something like 10% of tenants have attorneys. And your likelihood of being evicted if you have an attorney is probably like 10%. And if you don't have an attorney, it's more like 70% or 80%. Those are like rough numbers. And if folks are really interested, I can go pull up the data on that, but those are just rough numbers. Don't call me on any of that.
No, I'm going to quote you on that. But so my follow up to that is like, right now, how hard is it to get an attorney for a tenant eviction case if you're a tenant?
So, I mean, I think the biggest factor here is that folks are not often aware that they can go get an attorney. There's a great tool called stayhousedla.com. So if this applies to anyone right now, stayhousedla.org. And this is especially, because of the pandemic, the county, the city have been forced to make this centralized space where if you are sort of like being subject to an eviction, you can go to this website called stayhousedla.org and go over there and see if you can get an attorney for your help. Now, before the COVID-19 pandemic, this system was a lot more haphazard, right? You might show up to court, and if you're lucky, somebody from Inner City Law Center, maybe somebody from LAFLA or Public Counsel or some other sort of legal organization were kind of just like stationed there at the courthouse. And, it's possible you talk to somebody and be like, hey, is anybody here to help me out? And the court might have sent you our way. But the system was much more haphazard, right? If you didn't know about the resources, if you didn't know who to call, sometimes very difficult to find out. Now, that being said, if everybody did know about the resources, there wouldn't be sufficient number of attorneys to provide services to everybody, because obviously all of us have limited funding, mostly from the city, from the county, to do this work. But all that being said, right, before COVID, the system was quite haphazard. I think Steve, do you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I just want folks to, when we talk about the Right to Counsel campaign, right, it's also a campaign of equity. So there's a huge divide between landlords and tenants right now. Most tenants, we're already struggling to pay our rent, we're already struggling to pay our food, and we can't afford to have access to sort of private lawyers like landlords do. So it's definitely an issue of equity. And it's also interesting when you look at the numbers, when sort of you look at who are really the head of households. I know there was a study I recently saw that it showed that mostly Black women were actually head of households. just to give folks some context in terms of, we're talking in a space of racial equity, racial reckoning, excuse me, as of last summer. So definitely we want to make sure that RTC creates that space and also ensures that we're changing the structure of systems, right? Because at the end of the day, what is it good if we create a system that continues to not function correctly, but the benefit of an RTC sort of thing is we're helping to create a new system and a new way of how this works. Sorry, Muddy.
No, thanks for jumping in. I'm just seeing Walter had a question, which I'm able to answer. Is there any hope that the ability for tenants to have counsel increase the amount of incarceration, low dwelling declines? Question, Walter, I think so. Usually the attorneys who do tenant protections are kind of like that's their specialty. And so the attorneys that do like criminal defense, there's a whole different group of attorneys. So I don't know if that's necessarily going to have an impact. Although, as we know, public defender attorneys are also just like literally sitting on thousands of piles of like cases. So that's a whole different issue, which also requires a lot of work, and hopefully we get more the city and county puts more funding to that there for too.
And while we're on this subject, and we got a few questions coming in now, so this is great. We have somebody, Elvista. I don't know. I feel like I'm butchering that. I'm sorry. Elvista. Do you want to say more?
I'm sorry?
You want to say more about your comment you dropped in the chat here?
Well, I'm the CEO of a nonprofit, and our main purpose is to build affordable housing. I could go on and on about the obstacles that we have encountered, but what I do realize, because I too was chronically homeless. I experienced it. I'm disabled. I experienced the discrimination. I experienced it all. But what I did learn from my experiences, in order for us to be successful, once we get housing, we need essential professionals in our lives. And number one, we all need a broker that's going to go over our contracts. We all need a lawyer that's going to be there in case there is legal issues. We all need support from our pastors. We need support from our family. These are things that we need in order to be successful once we get this housing. I was just piggybacking off the point when you guys were talking about the attorneys. Every last one of these people that are threatening chronic homelessness, they need to have a lawyer. Every last one of them. But we could address the issue with the shortage by putting together a team of brokers. When I say brokers, I mean real estate brokers. Somebody that's going to canvass the area, go out and talk to all the potential owners to get people on board. But we need some type of funding for that. That's the only thing I wanted to throw out there. We really need more people on the ground that's actually going knocking on doors, going to the county recorder's office, seeing what property is up and available so we can aggressively do this.
I love that. And damn, I wish we would have met earlier. We need to organize all the realtors. We were just talking about this morning.
Yeah.
I think the point you're making is so critical, actually, because the majority of realtors don't have the same perspective and lived experience that you do, and are purely in the business of commodification. And that's
right. Exactly. Well, people ask me, well, why aren't you working to sell houses? Because I don't believe people should sell their house. I believe that it's important for your family to keep your house. So even the homeless people, they need a permanent housing solution, not just something temporary where they're paying subsidized rent. Now there are some grants coming up through HUD, whereas they want us to build affordable housing, but they only say, okay, you can only spend $15,000 per unit. That's not too much that we can build for $15,000 per unit. But I'm working with another unit in Los Angeles, and that construction company, all they do is affordable housing. So we're working to try to figure out how can we build something that's comfortable, that people want to live in and actually own for $15,000. So it's really rough. But this Assembly Bill 679, maybe that'll give us more options because it's just not enough funding there. And with HUD, they want you to have like 0.05% down of your own money before they will give you a grant to build homes. So it comes with a lot of caveats. And you guys are working to get around those caveats. And that's why I'm here.
Thank you so much for sharing that. You're in good company. I can
Yes.
see that. I mean, and I'll hand this one off to Sarah, but Gwendolyn made a really interesting point here, just how expensive it is. And this is connected to what you were just saying, Alvista, but building affordable housing is such a long, complex, expensive activity. Notwithstanding what the coalition is proposing, is it feasible or is there any work being done to advocate for jurisdictions to incentivize commercial property owners with unused or underused property to acquire the property and convert it into housing? Sarah, do you want to take a stab at that? I know you don't have all the answers because La Casa doesn't exist yet, but what would we want to do with La Casa?
Yeah, I'll definitely take a stab at that. So one aspect of it that's related but not related is there's a lot of conversations about, and one of the reasons why we're doing this LA County wide versus just the city of LA wide is because there are so many jurisdictions and cities within LA County that we want to make sure doing their fair share. And so one thing that, again, what Mike said, it hasn't been created yet. And so there's still a lot of conversations going on. But one thing that we've talked a lot about doing is having different ways of incentivizing communities so that they would be required to build affordable housing in order to get the funding that La Casa would create. And so that's people love money. And so that's a huge aspect of it. But we've also had conversations about different kind of innovative ideas, kind of like what you're talking about, of how can we have different incentives for whether it's a hotel being converted, it's like a motel conversion type thing, or making it so that there's more different kind of rules around land use so that there can be easier conversions, things like that. And so that's something that, we're trying to build this out and trying to figure out exactly what it would look like. But those conversations are definitely ongoing and definitely things that, whether it's through La Casa or something else, I think are, like you said, Gwendolyn, like they would be impactful and it would be an easier solution than some of the things that are happening right now. And so those are definitely things that we're keeping an eye on and definitely encourage folks to keep thinking about and sharing ideas like that, because we want to be thinking outside of the box and we want to get out of the broken system that we're in. And we can only do that through really kind of breaking it down in different ways and creating new opportunities.
Thank you for that, Sarah. All right. Anybody else? Anybody got any questions? Anne, it's great to see you. You're like a regular with our workshops. I love it. Is there anything you want to add, Anne? I saw you had a couple.
No, I just, I mean, at heart, I'm an advocate. And so whatever is happening that I feel is important in terms of Los Angeles and our advocacy, it's important to me. And one of my Speak Up advocates is here, which I'm so excited about, which I had no idea. So.
Is that John?
Yep.
Right on. Thanks for coming, you guys.
Another question in the chat that we've sort of talked about, but not exactly, about why we think 679 is a solution, like the best solution to what we're talking about. And I think that everyone kind of has probably their own reasons, but I'll share that my reason is because just having done this work for not even that long, just a few years, one of the things that's really striking to me is just how incredibly broken the system is and how it seems like it's designed to not work. And that the places that we currently have folks having to go to for the resources that they need just have way too much red tape, are not run super efficiently, and really make it hard for people to access the things that they need, both for people experiencing homelessness, but also for affordable housing developers and folks trying to do things like right to counsel. And so it isn't necessarily it's not a bill around homelessness, but we really talk a lot about how we think that our homelessness crisis is our housing crisis. have to get the housing built so that people can be housed. Even though we are housing people at unprecedented numbers over the last several years, our homelessness is growing at unprecedented numbers because people are just falling out of the housing that they have. And so that's one of the reasons why, or I guess several reasons why, I really think 679 is different, because it breaks out of those molds. It comes together with folks leading it that are a part of the work, like people, that have been doing the work would be a part of those kind of like that the people governing that. And so I think it's really important to really just try innovative solutions and do something different than the molds that we have right now that would be quicker and easier.
If I could just chime in on that, I also think it's super important to build upon history and knowledge. So oftentimes when these programs are created, they're created on expectations that were done in some formula that somebody thought could happen. Sort of SB 679 is really done on the experience of many, many housing advocates, housing developers, and government, right? So it's not just building upon one field of knowledge, but a collective field of knowledge to make it more realistic. Because at the end of the day, right, it's the folks that have gone through the red tape that know how to cut it. I also think the other important for 679, well, it's not directly a homelessness bill per se, it's definitely a community bill. Because at the end of the day, we're trying to ensure that folks have access to the space so that as communities are gentrifying, even though we are building housing and getting folks housed, we need to build more, and we need to be able to ensure that folks are able to say, well, I no longer say I once lived here. Folks can say I still live here and I can live here long term because the resources were put in place.
Can one of you guys talk a little bit about the opportunity that La Casa presents with social housing as well? Because I think this is a concept that we've been hearing more and more about over the last few years, and some of our city leaders talk about it, but it's definitely not a popular concept yet, but one that I think La Casa might be able to help make a reality. Madi, Sarah, Steve, you guys have any thoughts on social housing and what La Casa can do there?
Yeah, I mean, I think when we're talking about like affordable housing, and there's a couple people who talk about like developing affordable housing, it's a process. I mean, it's a process. We're seeing people doing the amazing work of getting those housing units up. I mean, but it's taking what, 6-7 years, and people are saying between 6 and 15 sources of funding. They need to get a couple grand from the federal government, a couple grand from the state, a couple grand from the city, beg, borrow, and steal from everybody who's willing to fund some affordable housing. And it's a process that people are doing. I mean, I really appreciate everybody out here. I don't know if anybody here is affordable housing developer, but truly amazing work. I think this idea of social housing is like a couple things. Like, first of all, affordable housing, for all the good things about it, sometimes it's not developed by an affordable housing developer, might not be permanently affordable, right? Might have a 55-year covenant, maybe a 30-year covenant. Either way, 55 years, we all know, is not forever. 55 years is a long time, but definitely not forever. So social housing, the idea of like publicly owned land, publicly owned, keeping it affordable forever. I think the other aspect here is bringing in community control and like tenant control of properties, right? I know some of the concerns sometimes people have with affordable housing development, permanent supportive housing is sometimes feeling that there's arbitrary rules that they're not a part of making those decisions, right? Obviously, those of us know, I would say most of us are renters here in LA. Landlords make rules, sometimes very arbitrary. Right now, many affordable housing developers do great work. Some affordable housing may have rules that are overly restrictive that sometimes seem arbitrary. So having a control in that. I think the idea of social housing is, broadly speaking, how do we make affordable housing permanently affordable that has the ability of the tenants to control some aspects of their lives and to bring in, make sure that these properties are funded properly and forever. How does 679 play into that? 679 plays into that partially because one of the things that we can do with 679 is create a full funding source for a property, what we're calling a single funding source for property. So rather than going and finding those 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 15 funding sources, SB 679 would allow sort of a developer to apply either to La Casa or one of the cities and counties that would be administrating these programs to be the single funding source for a property, and to create sort of new innovative models and to experiment with models that tenants might work with. So it really does present this amazing opportunity here.
And just real quick on the social housing piece also, social housing was something that has been invested in for many, many decades right after the war, right? So after the big World War, a lot of the housing complexes were created to ensure that folks could have the right to housing and that the resources were being provided for folks coming back from the war. As the federal government disinvested in the sort of projects or social housing model of that time, a lot of the projects sort of got demonized. So and one of the things that never was talked about was the reason why those properties were getting sort of dilapidated, excuse me, I can't say that word, was because of the lack of having an actual funding source, right? Every year the federal government took away money, more and more money, and it became harder to sort of provide this long-term solution where folks have lived at. When we organized in the public housing developments, folks had lived there for 35, 45, 50 years. It was sort of the ample field for people to be able to send their kids to college and sort of build community. When you look at sort of the social housing model of public housing in New Orleans, for example, people were building, like it was like the centerpiece of the city. So La Casa, for example, can provide a dedicated funding source to ensure that the upgrades are being met so that people can live in actual decent, safe, standard housing.
Thank you both. Okay, I got Keith with his hand up, and then I think we're gonna wrap, give you guys a couple links to take home. Keith, what do you got for us?
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Michael. So I'm on the Homeless Advocacy Committee for the Palms Neighbor Council. And I'm the one that asked the question about why do you feel this is the best solution for some of the challenges that we talked about tonight. And the reason why I asked the question is because La Casa is, this Senate bill creates La Casa. It also creates a 13-member board, a governing board, and a 9-member advisory committee. And we have to feed all those groups, and we're feeding it through ballot measures, issuing bonds, and then some additional taxation measures that we have on SB 629. And I'm wondering, why can't we just take that money and streamline it instead of creating this 3-layer bureaucracy? Streamline it, and so more of those funds go towards the services and the housing than to feed this animal that we're creating. So that's the question. I'd like to know why this is the solution and not take all that money and just put it on like boots on the ground stuff.
I think that's a very, very good question, and clearly you're tracking this thing. So we actually were talking about this morning. The attitudes of voters across LA County is quite conservative. And right now, we know through lots of polling, because we do a lot of polling before we get ourselves too far deep into anything, that right now overall there's attitudes are very hostile to anything supporting the status quo. Anything that would give the county more money to distribute is not very sexy right now. And the creation of an agency is a more appealing opportunity because we are not recreating, or we're not feeding something that has proven time and again to not be entirely effective. The other piece that I would add, and obviously this is just my interpretation, so take what you hear with a grain of salt. But the other piece that I'll add is that La Casa is all about creating capital construction dollars, right? It's not going to be a homeless services agency. We already have that. It's not going to be a housing authority. It's simply going to be a conduit to push these dollars out directly to developers so that we get these things built, to push these dollars out to the County of LA's Right to Counsel program, which right now has no money and needs about $180 million a year to function. And so legally, and in terms of the political realities of Sacramento, one of the few paths to get there to consolidate funding is by creating something that's new, that's shared in leadership, and that doesn't have a lot of skeletons in its closet. I think that's kind of that would be my very rough interpretation and explanation for why, this approach might be the best option that we have right now, at least for LA County, because again, state of California doesn't want to do something like this at the state level. And I think if we had tried to go to Sacramento and do a state bill that was going to create a statewide housing solutions agency, it would have never made it out of Senate, right? And so I think part of the reason why we've advanced it so far and kind of put Speaker Rendon in a pinch here is because people want it, people are open to it, and that's bearing out right now. I don't know if anybody else wants to add to that.
Can I just chime in real quick? Sorry.
Before we do that, Mike, can I just add one thing? If that's the case, and I'm not arguing the point, can you hear me okay? I can hear you moving your ear over.
I'm
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Can I add, I would suggest adding one thing to SB 679. So Ron Galperin, who's the controller for LA, has identified that 39% of the construction costs for housing for the homeless is going to soft costs, things that are not the ground, not the building, not the stuff that goes inside the building. So if we want to add more money to the construction of housing for the unhoused, I would suggest in this bill that we waive all the soft costs, the CEQA costs, building permits, all that stuff. That's just, they don't need that money. We can just, all of that, instead of going to soft costs, we'll go to tangible things in the building. And we just increased our building allotment by 39%, because I'm going to guess that the county percentages are going to be similar to what the city says. So that's my suggestion. Thank you for giving me the audience.
I think we're on the same page, actually. I think in this instance, we recognize those soft costs have been such a huge burden to the price per unit at the end of the day. Steve?
Yeah, just real quick. I also feel like it's super important to highlight, like oftentimes we forget or have these conversations about what the bureaucracy is or how the bureaucracy functions, right? When Manny talked about the 13, 14, 15 forms of affordable housing funding that need to be put together that all take 6, 9, 4, 10 different years to sort of put together to make a project come together. Like those are all things that are locally implemented and sort of end up helping to create these sort of soft costs as well that we oftentimes forget about. So I totally agree. Like we should waive all that money so we can have more money there. But I think the issue when you look at La Casa, it's really about we're trying to cut down the level of bureaucracy by streamlining how funding can be put in place. So at the end of the day, a developer who wants to build something doesn't have to go to all these sources and then still go to the bank, then still find a tax credit investor, and then finally be able to break ground. And then once they break ground, have an issue with the fire department because the fire department has another issue, or have a planning issue and so on, right? So like at the end of the day, like we're trying to expedite stuff. And one key method of expediting stuff is ensuring that all the money's in one place, right? Just like when you go shopping, you don't want to swipe 10 different credit cards. You want to be able to have the power to swipe one card if you need it or pay in cash. And that's going to make stuff be built much faster so that we don't have to rely upon these other sort of methods.
Beautifully stated, Steve. Always good to have you. Okay, that was great, guys. We had no trolls too, which is also nice. We always, we're always paranoid about that. Okay, we're gonna drop a few links. Sarah Thomas just dropped in a link for the click to call function. If you wanna hit up Sacramento, tell them how you feel about SB 679, bam, the link is right there in the chat. I'm also, I'd be remiss to end this meeting without mentioning that we also very much care about a couple of other coalitions. We care about the Healthy LA Coalition, the Reimagine LA Coalition is working on Measure J funding, which is kind of a crazy mess right now, and they need supporters. So we want to just do a quick plug for them. If you guys want to see or join another workshop, check out our events page on the Everyone In page. Let me get the link for that. Bam. And then last but not least, Frank, who's been silently controlling our our deck tonight. Thank you, Frank. He loves it when we collect stories from people that join these workshops. So we dropped a link there. Sarah just dropped it. It's called a video ask. All you got to do is click on it. You're going to see Frank's beautiful face, and he's going to give you instructions for recording a quick 10-second to 1 minute long, however long you want. The question is, why is affordable housing important for our community? Full disclaimer, whatever you put there might end up on our social feeds if it's really cool. So we just love hearing from our folks that join these workshops. I want to give a big thank you to our crew, to Madi, to Chase, to Steve, to Sarah, Gabby, Frank, and everybody who took the time out of their evening, in the middle of the week to join us. Thank you so much, you guys. It's great. Take care.